In this lecture, we're going to talk about international relations as theory, how it relates to science, and how it interfaces with ethics. So why do we need IR theory in the first place? One reason is that we can't rely on the accuracy or honesty of decision makers. If we were to ask people why they did things, they might have reasons to not be honest or clear with us, especially if they can't even recall these particular instances. So by theorizing, we can approximate why things happened in the world without having to ask the decision makers directly. Another reason is that it's easy to describe what happened in the past. It's not so easy to explain what has happened and the reasons for that. So what IR theory does is provide us with tools for actually explaining why things happened and potentially looking into the future to understand what we might expect. And another reason is that if we focus on any one individual perspective, we will be neglecting other ones. But the reality is that there are always multiple stories to tell. So what theorizing does is it cuts through the noise of having to ask multiple people or relying on any one individual account to provide us with a more holistic and comprehensive understanding of international affairs. Theorizing has for a long time been split along a major divide, which we continue to see in the social sciences and elsewhere. On the one side, you have positivists, or people who are called rationalists. They think that we can only know things that we experience directly. So if you asked someone why they experienced something, they might be able to tell you, but if you experiencing it yourself, that's the only way that you can truly know something is valid. There are also the fact that theories are separate from the world under their viewpoint, so we can sort of separate ourselves from the subject that we're studying. And then the focus is on explaining, so providing some kind of information about the relationship between causal factors, like this one variable resulted in this outcome. And then on the other hand, there are post or anti-positivists who are also referred to as reflectivists. For these group of people, knowledge can include things that are not directly observable, so things that we can't measure or that we can't simply ask someone about, but that we have to maybe learn about in some other indirect way. Another important difference is that for these people, theories are not separate from the world. Theories are created from a world which carries its own kinds of biases, along with the researchers who are using them. So we will never be able to fully divorce ourselves from the subjects that we're studying, and we need to acknowledge that. And then finally, the focus is on understanding or generating meaning about the world, not necessarily explaining causal relationships between variables. So what is the role of theories? One view, an explanatory view, holds that theories are devices to explain a world that exists apart from them. So we can again see ourselves outside what we're studying, we can come up with a theory, and that theory will help us to explain some kind of broad phenomenon. The other view is called a constitutive view. And here, theories can never be separate from the world. They are an intrinsic part of it. And any effort to deny that is really wrong or ignorant. And as you can see already, these map pretty cleanly onto the previous slide where we had the rationalists and the reflectivists. The rationalists tend to take an explanatory view, and the reflectivists tend to take a constitutive view. So how do we go about choosing a theory? Well, you have to first ask, what is it that you want to explain? What is the level of the phenomenon? Who is involved? What sort of subject matter are we talking about? So you will approach the topic of understanding which theory to select based on the kind of phenomenon you're interested in explaining or understanding. Another thing that's important to acknowledge is that each theory sees the world in a different way. I like to think of theories as different lenses. So each lens allows you to see, but they give you a different tint or hue with which you can see the world. Where you stand depends on where you sit. This means that we bring in our preconceived notions about the world, and to some extent, that affects what kinds of theories we are naturally drawn to. So people who have a military background might find it more easy to understand the realist theory, whereas people who maybe worked in international negotiations would be more inclined to abide by neoliberalism because it is more cleanly aligned with their real-world experience. So let's talk about some theoretical differences. The first way in which theories might differ from one another is in terms of ontology or theory of being. This refers to things that the world is made of, the kinds of objects that we study, the sorts of units of analysis. So for a lot of our IR theories, the unit of analysis will be the nation state. But that isn't the only thing that's relevant in international relations. So we'll see as the semester progresses, some theories invite in other kinds of actors because they feel that they are also relevant to the conversation about what influences international relations. So ontology is really about the stuff. What are we looking at when we conduct our theoretical analyses? The other side of this coin is epistemology, which is theory of knowledge. Or more clearly, how do we come to have knowledge about the world? What sorts of approaches or tools might we use in order to acquire that knowledge? So for some people who are positivists, we are going to look at the world and use tools in the form of measurable variables, right? So you could look at, for example, the number of chemical weapons a country possesses, or the percentage of a population that approves of its leadership. These are the kinds of things that a positivist would say are important to understanding about the world, to creating more knowledge. Whereas, as we talked about a moment ago, post-positivists might look more at factors that have to do with understanding or generating meaning. So they might, like, for example, survey the landscape of people who were involved in a decision-making process, realizing that they're not going to come to some sort of singular conclusion about what sort of result was achieved, but they will have many different perspectives that give them an idea about the complexity with which those decisions were made. So positivism is one form of epistemology, post-positivism is another form. And then we have methods. What are the kinds of actual tools, social, scientific, or otherwise, that we are going to bring to bear on our research question? And so we might, for example, utilize formal modeling, which involves the use of math to approximate dynamics throughout the world, like the point at which countries are going to devolve into civil war once they have been devoid of natural resources. But we also have other kinds of tools like qualitative research methods, for example, doing case studies or focus groups or elite interviews or even field experiments. Where we are, actively soliciting the opinions of people that we're talking with. Although experimental methods in general could be their own kind of methodological approach, which utilizes either qualitative or quantitative methods. But the point remains that once we have our research question, that should motivate the kind of methods that we employ to answer it. So normative IR theory is about the way in which we see the world as it ought to be. And there are different ways of looking at this, which we're going to talk about now. The first is viewing international relations from a communitarian perspective, in which membership in particular communities and participation in their practices are morally defining. So basically what the community views as moral or immoral becomes the standard by which things are judged on that basis. So if you're a member of a community of democratic states, what you think of as moral may be very different from what members of the community of authoritarian states might think of as moral. Another one looks less at communities but more at individuals, but then ties people together. So a cosmopolitan viewpoint considers everyone to be a citizen of the world. So all of us are essentially equal. All of us are citizens who occupy the same planet, who has duties to everyone else globally. So what I do as a consumer in the United States might affect someone who is working to reclaim precious metals in a trash heap somewhere in Africa. Or it might affect what a company in Japan does with selling its products. Or it might affect the human rights of people in indigenous groups who are living in lands where there are oil companies who are currently exploiting their native territory. So if we view ourselves not as the members of given societies, like nation states, but rather citizens who are all united because we live in the same world together, then that animates concerns about common duties that we have toward each other. Another approach is known as deontology. And here, it starts with certain principles by which we can ascertain that some actions are wrong, regardless of their consequences. So, for example, you think that war is always wrong, no matter what the outcome is. You don't care that maybe it prevented another war farther down the line. If you view war as inherently evil and wrong, as a deontological basis, you won't care about the consequences. That won't bear on whether going to war was good or bad, because you believe it to be fundamentally wrong. Another approach that's different from this is consequentialism, where we make choices based on the outcomes of our decisions. So here, our decision might actually, the outcome of that decision might actually be beneficial. So using again this example of warfare, if the war that we engage in today might prevent a war of much greater scope and scale down the road, then from a consequentialist perspective, it may be advisable and indeed moral to engage in that war today if it will stop that much bigger war from happening tomorrow. And then another approach is known as the doctrine of double effect. Here, it is permissible to perform an action even if it results in foreseeable harm, as long as this harm is not directly intended. So, for example, if a country decides to destroy a facility, like a nuclear facility, no one is killed in the process. It only results in the destruction of this facility, this building. And but one person accidentally dies in the process, right? There was a janitor whose turn it was, because of his shift, to clean the building. The country didn't anticipate and didn't intend to kill that janitor who was in that nuclear facility. But the nuclear facility, being no longer in existence, might no longer pose a threat to neighboring countries or other countries throughout the world. So because that harm to that individual was not directly intended, and because the goal of eradicating the potential for a nuclear threat was achieved, under the doctrine of double effect, that action may have actually been moral because we didn't consider it does not enter into our moral calculus that the person who died in this process was harmed because we didn't intend to harm them in the first place, so the ends sort of justify the means. So what are some key insights from understanding international relations and how it relates to norms and ethics? Norms matter in world politics, even though they're often difficult to identify. And in fact, there's this phrase that we use where we only know a norm when it's been violated. What seems to be true in many cases. Norms do affect outcomes in international relations. The question is how much, and the durability of those norms, and how do they compete with other kinds of interests. Another insight is that sites of value affect issues of inclusion. So the things that our societies value, the people, the issues, the areas of the world, that will affect the kinds of things that we bring into our realm of consideration. What sorts of things we include when we make our decisions. So what we value affects what we include in those processes. And the global realm is one of moral agents and therefore moral responsibilities. Moral agents are individuals, in most cases, who possess a rational capacity to judge the moral quality of their decisions. So if you're able to know that your actions will have moral consequences, it means that you have moral responsibilities to act in a certain way. This is no less relevant in the case of international relations, where we assume that leaders and indeed states are acting morally, or at least capable of acting morally, which suggests that they have responsibilities to each other, to their citizens, and so on. So, finally, we're going to talk a little bit about E.H. Carr and morality. He talks about three perspectives on what he sees or has written about as the incompatibility of politics and morality, which are two issues that are often brought to bear in conversations about international relations. So on the one hand, there's a perspective called non-resistance, which is a complete abnegation or boycott of politics altogether. The idea is that we don't even want to be part of the process so we can wash our hands of any responsibility. But oftentimes we're caught up in these processes, whether we like it or not. So non-resistance may not be a very effective tool at being able to claim some kind of conscientious objection to whatever's going on. Another perspective is anarchy or anarchism, in which we have to destroy power in order to restore morality. Here, hierarchy is viewed as negative, and so what we need to do is destroy whatever hierarchical situation is in place, and that will allow morality to re-enter the conversation. But of course, in the state of nature, if you've read Thomas Hobbes, you know that people will eventually come together and erect their own sovereign in order to restore order by giving up some of their freedoms. So anarchism may actually eventually lead to the restoration of some kind of power differential. And then finally, there's a laissez-faire perspective in which politics is viewed as necessary but non-moral. So we can keep ourselves at a distance from politics, recognize that it is necessary in order to distribute resources, resolve conflicts, and so on, but view it in a way in which it is non-moral. But of course, the problem here is that oftentimes there are these unintended consequences that have moral implications. So even though we might want to take a step back from any kind of politics, morals may actually still enter the frame because of the consequences or the nature of the decisions that we'll have to take. So that's it for now, and I look forward to seeing everyone for next week's class.